This is the 10-Minute Teacher Podcast with your host, Vicki Davis.
Today's sponsor is JuiceMind. I use their Kahoot-like platform to teach coding with pre-made quizzes perfectly aligned with the many computer science courses offered to students. Stay tuned at the end of the show for more on how I'm using JuiceMind in my computer science courses. Today we have my friend Eric Sheninger. He's been a principal, he's a thought leader, he's a change leader, works with schools all around the world, CEO of Aspire Change EDU, author of many books, including Disruptive Thinking in Our Classrooms. And Eric, today we're going to talk about true student engagement. As you were traveling the world, what are you seeing in 2024 in terms of student engagement?
It's one of those things that is not new. And I challenge anyone that, a lot of the things that we're trying to implement are not new, but are we doing them consistently and with continuity? When we think about engagement, the key is, are students engaged in learning? I always like to think about, well, who's doing the work? Is the teacher doing all the work, or are they powering those learners through agency to apply their thinking in relevant and meaningful ways? And what I see as I spend a lot of time with one of my many hats, but my favorite hat is my coaching hat. When I'm working in classrooms with leaders, a lot of our conversations are revolving around, how do we move from compliance to engagement and learning? And how do we define compliance? Students are taking notes, they're watching a video, they're doing a low-level worksheet. They are just sitting there passively consuming. We want to move away from that. I'm not saying get rid of direct instruction, whole group. That's still a high effect strategy when you look at meta-analysis from John Hattie. But how do we really get those students not only thinking at higher levels, but applying their thinking in interdisciplinary ways to solve real-world problems, and real-world problems that are unpredictable?
So you have on your blog, and you've written about the relevant thinking framework. Is being relevant to their everyday lives part of increasing engagement?
I think it's making the attempts. And here's what I say to every single teacher and administrator. You will not engage every single learner. It is impossible. I know I work with adults, and working with adults is harder than working with kids. I will not engage everyone because I don't know what's going on outside the session. Same thing with the classroom is, you can only control what goes on in your classroom. You cannot control what's happening in the hallways, other classrooms, or at home. So what I like to say is, how do we create the conditions to engage as many learners as possible? And it begins with having clarity in our practice. And that clarity, revolves around what I feel are simple in theory, but in practicality, again, it comes back to that consistency and continuity. How do we engage learners at various levels of, whether you call it DOK, Bloom's taxonomy, levels of cognition, doesn't matter to me. It's all the same thing. How do we challenge them to think? But looking at the relevant thinking framework, how do we make learning meaningful, purposeful, authentic? And I like to think it goes back to the work of Madeline Hunter, who coined the anticipatory set, or you might call it a hook. So those first couple minutes, how do we attempt to make that connection to something that students see that relevance? And coming back at the end, closure. Why did I learn this? How will I use it outside of school? And what tells me if I'm successful? I'm a realist. I think it's making attempts. It's hard. And we don't want to give teachers more to do. We already know that, hey, just another thing is not going to work. So I do think the attempts to make it relevant and meaningful, because that's what we want as adults.
So then there are the educators who come to you and say, Eric, everything's changing because of AI, and we want our kids to be employable and have a successful future. And what do we even do with that? Like, you've got that element on top of engagement, which, as I asked my students the other day, can you cheat yourself? And they said, absolutely. We can siphon off learning experiences and not have them if we cheat ourselves with these different tools. So how does that fit in the equation with student engagement?
I abide by the pedagogy first, technology second, if appropriate. And when I'm working with educators, and I get emails all the time now, Eric, can you speak on AI? Can you speak on AI? And as I'm working with teachers, administrators, AI is the last thing. That is the what. But
Mhm.
I think it comes back to how can we leverage a tool to make learning relevant? And
Mhm.
what I will do when I provide feedback to teachers and administrators about how do we increase engagement? How do we make learning relevant? I will take the standard. I will look at where, how the instructional design is focusing on that standard. But if that relevance piece is missing, I'll plug it into AI and say, how can you make this relevant to fifth grade students based on that standard? And what happens is the whole idea with AI is how does it save time? We're focusing so much on the tool and how to use AI, but not coming back to where are those opportunities to grow. And I think for me, and I can only speak personally, AI has been so relevant to my work as a consultant, as a coach, as a keynoter, because it's helping me save time, but also fill in gaps that I'm able to identify from reflection. And I think that's the key point here is the tools will continue to change. AI is probably one of, if not the most disruptive force impacting education right now, but it still comes down to how our ability to facilitate
Mhm.
engaged lessons, to provide teachers feedback. AI is not going to do that for us. So I think we have to tread lightly here and always come back to what is the research telling us is an effective practice? How are we showing evidence that what we are doing is actually impacting, in this case, student engagement and learning, and then look to where AI can help to fill in those gaps.
Because it's still about great teaching. For me, it closes the gap between formative assessment and adjusting my instruction. I can take a look at a practice quiz I gave and upload that PDF and say, questions 3 and 7, my students are having trouble with. Give me 3 more questions like those 2. Like that's a game changer for me. That saves me so much time. I was going to do it anyway. So I'm taking that 30 minutes where I would have written those and it's giving me a draft, getting me 80% of the way there, but it's still that relationship with my students. Great teaching. All of that is still very much the same. So let's take a trip around the world. I want you to think about the places you've been, which is a lot. And I know you're getting ready for another world tour, and think about like, I saw this and it was amazing. Like, what are and you don't have to name names unless you want to, 1 or 2 or 3 things that you've seen in a couple different subject areas where you're like, yes, they're getting it.
I remember I'll be heading back to the Middle East in May, and I was there in October. They're really looking at replacing conventional ideas with innovative solutions to authentic problems. And these
Mm.
students came in and they showed me not only a business model, but their prototype for how they were going to solve this problem. And what I saw was purposeful use of technology, choice, higher order thinking, relevance in terms of going back to the relevant thinking framework, being able to solve real world unpredictable problems. Here in the United States, in Quest Academy Junior High, whose principal you will be having on your podcast later this year, some of the best the best competency based learning that I've ever seen.
Wow.
They've got rid of grades, got rid of points. They've unpacked every standard into rubrics. But the one thing that they really focused on was making learning relevant,
Mm.
bringing in student voice, choice aligned to standards, providing writing prompts. Do this prompt on point of view to describe how your dad would teach a TikTok dance. Here's a prompt based on the recent World Cup in 2022. I like those examples. I love that question because educators are doing amazing work. They are being able to innovate with purpose. They're able to
Mhm.
show efficacy. And I think that's the key is the biggest changes are usually the smallest ones to our practice.
Mm.
And do we implement those changes consistently? Innovative practice could be having a hook at the beginning of the lesson, implementing an exit ticket consistently, looking at the formative data from the exit ticket and
Yeah.
determining if we're going to do a reteach. I do, we do, you do. So all these practices that we've been immersed in, what I'm seeing across the globe is the schools that are finding success are understanding they don't have to reinvent the wheel. They don't need to throw out the baby with the bathwater, but they do need to ask the right questions. And those questions are my students learning? Where's the level of thinking? How am I making learning relevant, meaningful? How am I meeting the diverse needs of my students?
Mm-hmm.
How is technology leveraged in a purposeful way? What do my learners think of the lesson? Questions are more important than answers, Vicki, and that's what I'm seeing across the world with the schools, the educators, the leaders who are making growth a consistent journey.
Excellent. So we've talked about the classroom. Let's talk about, because I know you have such a passion for principals and school leaders who you just get them and they get you. I've seen you interact with principals and it's just awesome. Think about, what would you say this moment in time to the principals out there? Because you kind of know where a lot of them are coming from. It's not necessarily the best place. I mean, a lot of places have turned corners. But then there were a lot of folks who kind of seem to be feeling like, as I talk to them, that like, when are we going to get out of this funk or this rut or this struggle that we still feel like we're in some ways, the teacher wellness and the exhaustion and all that, and in some cases push back with tech. Like, I don't want to use tech because we used it in distant learning and that was a horrible experience. So speak to those principals who may not have turned a corner, but they're ready for a new vision. They're ready for that excitement. They're ready for that culture to get shifted like it needs to be.
Yeah, and I can share a message for them based upon what teachers tell me. And there's two things that teachers tell me over and over again what they want. First is, Eric, we know the why. We need to know, how do we do it and what can it look like? So leaders, your ability to model, to connect to the research base, to be able to show examples of qualitative and quantitative evidence to support what you're trying to implement will really help to chip away at any mental block. The other thing is, teachers tell me over and over again, Eric, we want feedback. I will go out and say, the more traditional evaluation systems, they're not going to change practice. They haven't changed practice. But what does actually lead to changes in practice is non-evaluative feedback that is timely, practical, specific. It's a dialogue, not a monologue. As leaders, think about how you not find, but make the time to develop learning walk protocols to give that non-evaluative feedback. Because just like we want relationships with our students, that is how you'll build relationships with your staff. They want to see you present. They want to know that you understand that, using a tech example, purposeful use of tech is more than just a teacher using the interactive whiteboard. How do you give feedback on how the learners can use that interactive whiteboard? So those are the two pieces of advice that I would give leaders, because I think we all need to show ourselves some grace, regardless of the position that you're in. Yes, the times are stressful, but it truly is an amazing time to be an educator because of the resources that we have, how we connect with people that are already doing it. And I always say, we tend to focus on the things we cannot control. That's human nature. We have to focus on those things that we can control. And those things are few and far. But what are they from a leader's standpoint? Providing that feedback to teachers. And for teachers, what's the one thing you can control? How you use the time in class with your students.
Yeah. And you know what? Friday, I just interviewed my principal, who I had tweeted out back in October that I had 5 or 6 observations at that moment. And they were this informal pop in the classroom. And I had never seen it before, Eric. I mean, it was really kind of revolutionary. And it ended up, I wrote a chapter in our mutual friend, George Couros' new book about good principles, because that is actually what you're saying. As a teacher on the other end of that, I feel more supported. I feel a better relationship. I feel more partnership. And the thing is, the few times I've needed his help, like I had issues, it wasn't anything weird because the kids were already used to him being in my class, and he helped me troubleshoot some issues. And then when I wanted my kids to show off, when they had something they wanted me to see, they were already used to him being in the class. So it wasn't anything weird. Like, they were behaving. He didn't change the room because he walked in, because he's always in the room.
Exactly. And that's the thing is, I hear sometimes when I'm doing coaching cycles and the teachers be like, hey, Eric, this is the first time we've seen our principal in the classroom in months. And I think that's one of the smallest shifts that we can make is, you're not going to have all the answers. No one does.
Yeah.
But that support just by being there and then saying, hey, you know what, maybe think about how you can further scaffold your questions.
We could talk all day, but this is the 10-Minute Teacher and Eric Sheninger, amazing thought leader, getting ready to travel the world again. Hope to have you back on the show in the fall. I know there's an exciting new book coming out that we definitely want to talk about. But these are some practical examples, educators and leaders, that we can improve our classroom. It's still about teaching. Don't forget the things we already know how to do. And thanks for coming on the show, Eric. This has been fantastic. Today's sponsor is JuiceMind. JuiceMind teams gave me the alternative to the discontinuation of Replit and coding rooms in my AP Computer Science Principles course. This incredible tool is what I use to review with my AP students for their exam, but it also allows me to have coding prompts for my students to complete as quiz questions. If you're teaching coding, JuiceMind is a must-use tool. They already have flashcards, including coding prompts, for the most popular computer science courses, including the AP course that I teach. So go to juicemind.com. That's JUICEMIND, juicemind.com, and sign up today to start your computer science quizzing, team coding experiences, and super cool coding kit projects. I highly recommend JuiceMind for any schools teaching computer science, and I think every school should have coding courses. Try out JuiceMind today and tell them Cool Cat Teacher sent you.
You've been listening to the 10-Minute Teacher Podcast. If you want more content from Vicki Davis, you can find her on Facebook, X.com, TikTok, Threads, Instagram, Blue Sky, and YouTube at Cool Cat Teacher. Thank you for listening.